I have a story to share tonight. It's about women and winning the right to vote. We're going to celebrate courageous women in American history, women who challenged injustice and changed the course of history. She was one of them, Libby Smith Miller. Note the bloomers that she's wearing. That was in 1851. And those were a symbol of the independence that women were seeking. So it was a pretty good idea. A lot of them wanted to do it, but unfortunately, they were not a fashion hit. They were called unladylike, immodest, and most importantly, a violation of the Bible. So, as a consequence, the fad didn't last long. Susan B. Anthony even said, "The attention of my audience was fixed upon my clothes instead of my words." And it is the words that mattered to these women, who finally won the right to vote when the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified in 1920. So, tonight is about celebrating the 100th anniversary, which will actually take place next year. Just as our country has a significant presidential and general election coming a year from November. I'm assuming most of you know a little something about that. My name is Carol Jensen, and I represent the League of Women Voters of South San Mateo County. The League will also celebrate its 100th anniversary of its founding next year, and as you might imagine, the two events are inextricably intertwined. Just a brief word about the League of Women Voters. The League encourages informed and active participation in government. It works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and it influences public policy through education and advocacy. We never support or oppose candidates or political parties. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the states and the federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens on the basis of sex. Initially introduced to Congress in 1878, several attempts to pass a woman's voting amendment failed until 1919, when suffragists convinced President Wilson to call a special congressional session. On May 21st, the proposed amendment passed the House of Representatives, followed by the Senate on June 4th. It was then submitted to the states for ratification, formal approval. On August 18th, Tennessee was the last of the necessary 36 states to secure ratification. The 19th Amendment was officially adopted on August 26, 1920, and that was a big deal. It was the culmination of a decades-long movement for women's suffrage, both state and nationally. And what you see here, I love this picture, is Alice Paul. She's one of the big leaders in the movement. And when Tennessee submitted its vote, and the ladies knew that finally 36 states had ratified their amendment, they made a banner. And they put 36 stars on that banner. And that was one for each of the states that had voted to ratify the 19th Amendment. And at the time, keep in mind, there were only 48 states in the country, and 3/4 of them were needed to ratify. Now, as early as the formation of our country, women were seeking a voice in their government and legal protection in their lives. I love this. This is what Abigail Adams said to her husband, John, in 1776. "I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." In the early 1800s, the abolition movement was the root of the women's rights movement. Women were active in temperance, the abolition of alcohol, and support for education also trained women to speak up for their interests. And speak up they did. In New Jersey, for instance, that state actually gave suffrage to women property owners, but it was rescinded in 1807. It didn't last long at all. Undeterred, the suffragists held the first women's rights convention in 1848. Its founders were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And that convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 is traditionally held as the start of the American women's rights movement, attended by nearly 300 women and men as well. The convention was designed to talk about the social, civil, and religious rights of women. And it culminated in the adoption of something called the Declaration of Sentiments. This was signed by 68 women and 32 men. One of the clauses, for example, reads, "Resolved, that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise." The attendees were mostly white, middle, and upper class women, but they also included Frederick Douglass. And he's probably familiar to you because he was a very well-known orator, abolitionist, and writer. 72 years after that convention, only one attendee was still alive in 1920 to actually see women win the right to vote. Her name was Charlotte Woodward, and at the time, she was 88 years old. So the long road to full rights of citizenship included hundreds of early feminists. But right here, you're looking at the big three. We have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, next to her is Lucretia Mott, and this is Susan B. Anthony. All of these women were educated. Stanton and Mott had 13 children between them, so they were very busy ladies. Now, Susan B. Anthony never married, so she had a little more time on her hands. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were great friends for 50 years, and a huge part of their friendship actually was their partnership in the cause. Cady Stanton had a house full of kids, she had 7 of them, so she stayed home and did all the writing, while Susan B. did all the traveling, speaking to groups and pretty much anybody who would listen about the need for women's rights, which of course included the vote, but not only that, they were also advocating for equal pay for equal work, women's labor trade unions, 8-hour workdays, and oh yes, breast reform, prominent issues in the late 19th century that most of them are not all that different from what we're still fighting for today, except for maybe the bloomers. Thousands of African American women, meanwhile, were active in the movement as well, addressing issues of race, gender, and class, voting rights, of course, and they often did this through the church, but eventually they formed their own organizations. While white women sought to gain the vote as an equal voice in the political process, African American women often sought the vote as a means of racial uplift and as a way to create change in the post-Reconstruction era. Notable African American suffragists such as Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman advocated for the vote in tandem with civil rights for African Americans. Sojourner Truth, her story is interesting. She was sold by the age of 9 as a slave, and she managed later on to escape slavery. She never learned to read or write, but she was strong and intelligent, and she was not afraid to speak her mind. In 1851, she chastised white women's demands for rights without inclusion of black women. She famously said, "There is a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. And if colored men get their rights, and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before." Harriet Tubman, meanwhile, at age 5, was rented as a servant, but she eventually escaped slavery, and later in life, she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She also was a Civil War scout, a soldier, a spy, a nurse for the Union Army. And when she died, she was buried with military honors in New York. And this is a huge distinction because she's perhaps the only black woman to have ever been buried with military honors. Mary Church Terrell was the daughter of former slaves, but her parents became the first black millionaires. She was educated at Oberlin College. She was a teacher, she had 2 kids. She ended up partnering with Ida B. Wells Barnett to end the horrible practice of lynching. Ida was a founder of the National Association of Colored Women. She tirelessly worked for women's suffrage. She believed it key to lifting the status of black women and the entire race. In 1909, she was one of the founders of the NAACP. Now, Ida was born a slave, but she ended up educated, and then she investigated and wrote an expose on lynching. And what she wanted to do was to secure anti-lynching legislation. And she challenged white women suffragists for ignoring this issue in their platform. She lived in the South, but eventually she had to move north because there were multiple threats on her life. Activism addressing federal women's suffrage was minimal during the Civil War. In 1865, at the end of the war, a petition for universal suffrage, signed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, among others, called for a national constitutional amendment to prohibit the several states from disenfranchising any of their citizens on the ground of sex. The campaign was the first national petition drive to feature women's suffrage among its demands. And while many of these bills were introduced at the state level during this time, they were pretty much disregarded, and few even ever came to a vote. Rekindled during Reconstruction, women activists decided to work on both the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment to gain the vote for both former slaves and women. Well, the women worked closely with former slaves, like Frederick Douglass, to obtain rights for everybody. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were very bitterly disillusioned by the 14th Amendment that defined citizen and voter as males only. Furthermore, the 15th Amendment excluded the word sex, which would have included the right for women to vote. So since that word was left out, it meant that women would have to work for another 50 years to become full citizens. The 15th Amendment, in particular, created division among suffragists. Some responded to the sexist exclusion of women with racist arguments of superiority, which totally split up the suffrage movement. The American Equal Rights Association was an organization that supported suffrage for women and African American men. A national movement in support of suffrage for African American women began in earnest in 1896 when Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Wells Barnett helped found the National Association of Colored Women. After 1914, it became the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Their motto, "Lifting as we climb," referred to their temperance and women's suffrage efforts, which they shared pretty much with their white sister organizations. But this association also fought for the dismantlement of Jim Crow laws and things like improved child care, education, and housing. However, there was still a lot of tension between activists as they tried to figure out a way to get the vote for white women and black men. Educator Nannie Helen Burroughs was once asked, "What would an African American woman do with a ballot anyway?" And she responded, "What can she do without it?" Even so, these key members in the movement were unhappy with all the infighting, and so unfortunately, people like Frederick Douglass and Lucretia Mott and Lucy Stone, they all decided to leave. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony abandoned the American Equal Rights Association, which had supported universal suffrage, to found the National Woman Suffrage Association in 1869, stating that black men should not receive the vote before white women. In response, African American suffragists and others joined the American Woman Suffrage Association, which supported the vote for women and for black men. So now you had two kind of competing organizations. And guess what happened? I'm sure it comes as no surprise that these two groups eventually merged. It took 21 years, but they finally came together in 1890. The relationship, though, between African Americans and white activists remained strained. The question of how to get the vote for everybody remained unanswered. In 1913, two other groups, the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage and the Women's Party of Western Voters, joined to form what would become the National Woman's Party in 1917. And we're going to have a little bit more on this when we get to another very key figure in the movement. We saw her earlier, Alice Paul. But before Alice Paul came along, there was Carrie Chapman Catt. She succeeded Susan B. Anthony as the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Catt revitalized that group, turning the focus of the organization to the passage of a federal amendment, while also supporting women who wanted to pressure their states to pass voting legislation. She had a strategy which she called the winning plan, and these were the goals. Women in states that had already granted the right to vote for president would focus on passing a federal suffrage amendment. Women who believed they could influence their state lawmakers would focus on gaining primary suffrage. Would focus on amending their state constitutions. And then Southern states would focus on gaining primary suffrage, which meant the right to vote in state primaries. And at the same time, Catt's group worked to elect congressmen who supported suffrage for women. By 1915, this organization had become very large and very powerful. It was in 44 states at that point, and it had over 2 million members. So now we come back to Alice Paul, another very significant leader in the suffrage movement. When she started her National Women's Party, she ended the state-by-state effort to achieve voting rights for women, focusing instead trying to get everyone on board with this effort to have a constitutional amendment for the right to vote. So Alice Paul and her friend Lucy Burns, who had left the movement for a while with Frederick Douglass, well, Lucy decided to jump back in, and they founded the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in 1913 to pressure the federal government to once and for all take legislative action. So one of their first acts was to organize a women's suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd, 1913. That was the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. The procession of more than 5,000 people, and there are some accounts that say it had as many as 8,000 participants, was the very first of its kind. It attracted a crowd of about 500,000 people, as well as national media attention. But Wilson took no immediate action. In March 1917, the National Woman's Party formed and implemented aggressive, radical acts of civil disobedience to draw more attention to the women's voting issue. Well, Alice Paul was behind all of this. She adopted unladylike strategies from, of all people, the British. But those suffragists had figured out how to heckle politicians and how to protest with signs. And Alice thought, well, if it worked for them and they can do it, why don't we try this? So she did. She led the Silent Sentinels, which picketed the White House for 18 months. Because of that, she was arrested, she was tried, she was thrown in jail. She then led a prison hunger strike in which doctors attempted to force feed her and others who were arrested along with her. And so when the newspapers caught wind of this and began reporting about it, it only led to public outrage, which finally, in turn, in 1918, led to President Wilson's support of a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. When World War I started in 1914, women in 8 states actually did have the right to vote. But support for a federal amendment at that time was still very tepid. The war provided a new urgency to fight for the vote. When the U.S. entered World War I, Carrie Chapman Catt made the controversial decision to go ahead and support the war effort, even though there was widespread pacifist sentiment among many of her colleagues. As women joined the labor force to replace the men who were serving in the military, and they took visible positions as nurses and relief workers and ambulance drivers to support the war effort, Carrie and her group argued that their sacrifices made by these women made them deserving of the vote. Well, by contrast, the NWP, which was Alice Paul's group, used the war to point out the glaring contradictions of fighting for democracy abroad while restricting it at home. So in 1917, those Silent Sentinels took up their signs in front of the White House to bring attention to the cause of women's suffrage. And President Wilson, meanwhile, ignored the plea for the entire first term of his presidency. But then, as we said, in 1918, he finally had to cave and agreed to support a constitutional amendment because he was facing a very tough midterm and there was so much pressure on him from women's groups. There was a very organized anti-voting movement as well. These folks were known as anti-suffragists, and they had some pretty interesting propaganda. And what's also interesting about this group is that many of them were women. And their beliefs included notions like these. Women are too high-strung, irrational, and emotional to vote. Women aren't smart enough or educated enough. Women should stay at home. Women are too physically frail. And the worst of all, women would become infertile or masculine if they voted. Now, before 1920, here's a look at the state-by-state situation for suffrage. The darker brown states are the ones that provided equal suffrage. And if you can see, each state has a date on it, and those are the years in which those states approved equal suffrage for men and for women. There is some thought that perhaps those states out west, the newer ones to form, were interested in wooing women to come to their states. They needed female settlers, and they thought, why not? Let's give them a vote. Maybe that'll help. The states that are more in the middle of the country, the sort of peach-colored ones, most of them had partial suffrage for women. And the ones in the south and more to the east, the very light-colored ones, had no suffrage for women at all. The final push to victory began around 1914 with the constitutional amendment, which had been nicknamed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Once again, it was being considered in the Senate, where it was once again rejected. In April 1917, the Anthony Amendment, which did eventually become the 19th Amendment, was reintroduced in the U.S. House and Senate, failed again. In fact, between 1918 and 1919, that amendment went up for a vote 5 times. The House and Senate voted on it each time, and each vote was extremely close, but each vote failed. In May 1919, it finally passed the House, and the very next month, it passed the Senate. So Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul went to work getting the states necessary to ratify it. By August the next year, a 24-year-old Tennessee representative named Harry Byrne cast the deciding vote for that state. And I love this story because he changed his mind. At the very last minute, just moments before the vote was taken, he received a note from his mother telling him to vote yes. And so he did. The 19th Amendment, he was only 24, what are you going to do? The 19th Amendment was signed into law August 26, 1920, making the United States the 27th country in the world to give women the right to vote. This historic victory meant that 26 million American women would be able to vote in the 1920 U.S. presidential election. But the powerful women's voting bloc that many politicians had feared actually failed to materialize. And the 19th Amendment did not fully enfranchise African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, and Native American women. Bloc voting by women didn't emerge, so Congress no longer furthered programs for women because they felt like they didn't have to. In 1920, 36% of eligible women turned out to vote, compared with 68% of men. But you have to examine that low turnout among women because there were barriers. There were things like literacy tests that they had to take, long residency requirements, poll taxes. These ladies, all of them, completely inexperienced with voting, and persistent beliefs among many of them that voting was inappropriate for women. Women's groups, however, decided to focus on reform, and so they set about establishing the Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor. Research on infant mortality led to the passage of something called the Shepard-Towner Act, which made a dramatic difference in reducing infant mortality rates before it was allowed to lapse in 1929, which was really a shame because there had never been any legislation like that before. It was really very inventive and breakthrough, but it didn't last. So after the 1920 election, Alice Paul and her group drafted another piece of legislation. This one I'm sure you're all familiar with, the Equal Rights Amendment, to guarantee women constitutional protection from discrimination. Interestingly, the measure was opposed by Carrie Catt and the League of Women Voters. It floundered when it was introduced in Congress in 1923, but it did finally pass Congress in 1972. As of 2 years ago, It needed only 3 more states to ratify it in order to become part of our Constitution. In 2017, Nevada ratified it. In 2018, Illinois followed suit. So right now, where we are today, 1 more state, that's all we need, 1 more state to ratify, and we will add the 28th Amendment to our Constitution. So you can see that amending the Constitution, it's not just a thing that happened like back in 1920. It's a thing that can still currently happen if we put our minds to it. Now, about 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified, Emma Smith DeVoe and Carrie Chapman Catt agreed to merge their groups to help millions of women exercise their responsibilities as voters. This new organization became the League of Women Voters. Originally, only women could join, but in 1973, the charter was modified to include men. Today, the League of Women Voters supports and promotes the ERA, yay, as well as diversity, housing rights, and a host of other issues. There are 1,000 local and 50 state leagues and 1 territory league in the Virgin Islands. There's really no other national volunteer organization in this country that inspires such a great degree of commitment. And because of that, the league has evolved further from what it was in 1920, which was a mighty political experiment, to a unique, nonpartisan organization that is a recognized force in molding political leaders, shaping public policy, and promoting informed citizen participation at all levels of government. To me, the League of Women Voters could also be known as the League of Women Leaders, because so many women in this organization get out there and lead the way. And with that, I would like to acknowledge and thank, first of all of you for coming. I'm so happy to see your faces, and it's so gratifying to see that you are interested in this subject matter. But also, I would like to thank the Menlo Park Library and John Beaver for hosting this discussion, the League of Women Voters of Diablo Valley as well, and in particular a woman named Sean Gilbert, who created the original presentation of Winning the Vote. And then she was gracious enough to share it with our league so that we could adopt it for tonight. I also want to thank Linda, because she always, I couldn't do this without her. She's amazing. But honestly, it's those who came before us that we truly recognize. Never let it be said that women were given the right to vote. They fought, they sacrificed, and they suffered for this cause. They didn't stop until they prevailed. Women, in fact, won the right to vote. And we're here tonight to remember them and to honor them. Thank you very much. And there are some drinks and some little refreshments in the back, if anybody is interested.
Thank you.
Very, very welcome. Please, let's all share.
I read that the women protesting in front of the White House in the Wilson administration, every time President Wilson would give a speech talking about democracy in World War I, they would burn his speech in front of the White House because they had no democracy.
Well, isn't that food for thought?
So they got arrested.
Yeah. So, I thought that was so amazing that they, for 18 months, every day they were out there protesting. They never stopped. They were so persistent. But when you think about it, it wasn't just that. It was so many years, decades. And those, I'm sorry about how you had to go a little bit deep with all these various organizations, because it took, this was the effort it took. They continually tried to reinvent themselves in an effort to figure out what will get us toward our goal. So you had organizations forming left and right and blending and mixing, and it was very complicated, actually. It was very complicated to try to sort it all out.
And the big schism between supporting African American men's right to vote and the group that, no, everyone needs to get the right to vote. We can't break off with but women that realized, yeah, but if we try to make them include women, African men will never get the right to vote. So that was a big schism in the voting rights.
Yeah, completely understandable, because all three of those groups were disenfranchised, and all three of them needed to stick together. But there, you know, there was so much racial discord in the South that the white women thought, you know, maybe we don't want to go there because this could really hamper our effort. Maybe we just want to sort of not look at that and just keep going, charging right ahead with what we're planning to do. Which I think at a certain point in time became impossible for them to do. They had, when they were having that march in DC on, what was it, March 3rd, whatever, they were having that march, and, you know, African American women wanted to be involved in it. And so there was some thought, well, okay, they could be involved in it, but they have to be at the back. Yeah, but then several of the white female activists said, well, then I'm going to the back to march with them too. And so pretty soon it all blended. It didn't matter anymore, and they were all mixed together. Yes?
So I'm curious, were there any men, like people who wrote editorials and stuff, who actually believed that women should vote? Or was it totally the women fighting?
Yeah, there were some men. Now, the only one we mentioned was Frederick Douglass. Do you know of any other, like, names we recognize?
There were always men who were supporting women's suffrage along. I saw a picture of a headquarters for men supporting suffrage in the 1918.
Well, and Susan B. Anthony was the one that wasn't married.
Wasn't
right?
married, yeah.
So, not Carrie Talking Cat.
Elizabeth Cady.
Thank you. three names. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband was extremely supportive, and she couldn't have done everything she did with 7 kids.
With 7 kids.
And all without him being really supportive.
Yeah, there definitely were men, you know, involved in the cause, but by far and away, most of the men were the anti-sus. They were on the other side. The posters are hilarious. I wish I could show you guys more. I do want to point out this book because, especially for the League members, this is a book that Shirley let me borrow, and it's in the office, right? Do you keep it in the office? Winning the Triumph of the American Women's Suffrage Movement, The Vote. And a lot of the pictures that were in here are also in here, like Alice Paul unfurling the banner. And this book has it all and says it all. It's really, really well done by a man, I might add. So it was good and extremely helpful to me. So if anyone's interested in checking it out, I guess from the office, or just ask Shirley.
Menlo Park Library has a copy.
Yeah, who's the author of the book? I'll look it up here. Who's the author?
I think we donated.
Where can I find this? I've had it for months, so.
I'll post the author so he can look it up.
Okay.
We actually, the author actually came up to us and gave us those 2 books.
Oh,
and we donated
it's
one to the
signed.
library.
It's signed.
So the library does have one.
Well, that's not it does not necessarily follow.
May not be
They
in
didn't make it into
circulation.
the collection
Yeah.
Oh,
There's
it
a
was
whole-
donated.
process, and yeah,
John, it's Robert P.J. Cooney, C-O-O-N-E-Y,
thank you.
Junior.
And there's a really fascinating bit about California's fight to get suffrage. It was like 1911, I think.
Yeah.
And how a couple women got a convertible and drove.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and they really, they went to the far corners of California and went to the rural areas and got people excited about vote in the rural areas. That's what pushed us over.
I think that's in here. 'Cause
Yeah,
I
that's where I read it.
remember seeing something about that. Yeah, that was great. Yeah, the women, these women were determined, and they would stop at nothing and did outrageous things to get there, you know, considered outrageous at that time. Gotta hand it to them.
So when I put in winning the vote, I got in 4 results that do involve suffrage,
Yeah.
but none of them are this book. So that covers all of PLS, which is city libraries and the county library system.
Huh.
But the Menlo Park Library now is part of Link Plus, and we can get you books from all over the state. And this is one of those books. So we can get you this book from any one of several other libraries that do carry it. It's available, not tonight, not here.
Do you know,
Yes,
do you know anything about the ERA and what states or?
we were talking about that.
So,
Which state is it?
last winter,
Virginia.
Virginia was lining up their legislature to pass it, and that single state would have been the last one.
Can you
And then
imagine?
their political system, you know, with all the scandals and stuff, went to hell in a handbasket, and it was just, you know, I don't know if they'll ever get back to it or not. But there's another question too on the ERA. Some people in Congress say, well, it's been too long, deadlines have been passed and stuff like that. But I think they can fix that. It's certainly needed because we've never been able to get equal pay for equal work.
They wanted equal pay way back at the turn of the 19th century.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Susan B.
we've
Anthony
been
wanted
trying
it.
to
Can you
get it since.
What a concept.
A couple of things. Did you say that Alice Paul wrote the ERA?
Co-authored it,
That
yes.
long ago?
Yes, in 19,
20.
well, it came up for a vote, according to what I saw, and I think Linda too. The first vote it came up for was in 1923. So I think it was around 1920 she was co-authoring it with someone else, another woman in her organization.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I went to Washington for the ERA Extension March. That was in what, 70, 78, something like that? Yeah. So, yeah, it's amazing how long that has taken. And by the way, Virginia has a vote this year. All those delegates, all the state senators are up for election. So just
Put the pressure on
two in the Senate. and two in the
Postcards,
House.
postcards, Darcy. My friend Darcy, who came to watch tonight, and we do postcards, lots of postcards for whatever is going on. So I would think that would be a great topic, yeah, for the cards coming up soon.
We've been postcarding the whole state of Florida just for voter registration.
Yeah.
Because we know how important Florida is going to be.
Yeah,
So just the postcard just says, get out and vote, here's how you do it, you know, and it's a handwritten note from somebody and it's supposedly, I mean, I've never gotten a handwritten note from somebody like that in the mail, but supposedly they're very well received.
really.
And they're not
You wonder.
necessarily
Works
partisan.
really well.
Yeah.
Does
Yeah.
it? Because you really wonder, when you're sitting there on the floor at my coffee
With our
table,
crayons.
with my crayons and markers going, does this really work? I don't know, but you know, these states are far away. What else are you gonna do? So
Yeah.
at least it's something.
It's Tony the Democrat. If you Google Tony the Democrat, and it's this really cool system because they'll actually send you the email addresses, or they'll send you the addresses. You don't ever have a name, so you basically just write valued voter and their address, and then whatever the message is. So if we're helping a runoff election, or we did a lot of carding for Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and just things that we knew were going to be pretty tight elections. So, but the Florida campaign's pretty cool because it's just get out and vote.
Just get registered.
And so I'm working with Sister District, which works at state legislation levels, and yeah, very, very heavy on Virginia. Postcarding, phone banking, texting, fundraising. I know that the league is nonpartisan.
Wait, what's your button say?
Sister District,
Oh, that's cool.
yeah.
Great.
Thank you for that information on Virginia.
Yeah. That's good.
I think that if the league can support the ERA, then the league could have a postcard party.
Yeah.
Fine by me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll bring my markers.
You know, I had a funny kind of family history about this. I think my mother's aunt or somebody was opposed to the women getting the right to vote.
Yeah.
This is in Texas.
Now, is that where you're from? Where are you from?
Yeah,
Texas.
yeah. And her argument was that if a woman can't get her man to vote the way she wants him to, she doesn't deserve it.
Wow.
Very bizarre logic.
Wow.
You get 2 votes.
My grandmother went door to door supporting the suffrage movement.
Oh.
That is so good. Who saw the movie Mary Poppins with Julie Andrews?
Oh, yeah.
So that part about the British suffragettes, do you remember the mom in the movie?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I remember watching that movie. It was the first movie I ever saw in a theater. And I think I was 5 or 6. And my grandmother took me and my little sister. And I remember that mom and thinking, what? Like that whole concept was lost on me. I had no idea what any of that meant. But looking back on it, that's so cool.
Mrs. Banks.
Yes.
That's right, Mrs. Banks.
Jane and Michael Banks. That's right. Remember they write the letter, they write the advertisement for the nanny.
That's right, that's right.
Great movie.
Another interesting thing, I was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming a few years back, and they have pictures, historic photographs on buildings that you can walk around, and I saw this one of all these women in the late 1800s. Wyoming was one of the first states, if not the first state, to grant suffrage. And they had a slate, and
They had a woman senator or something was the first.
Wyoming,
69.
1869.
Yeah, followed by Utah.
Utah the following year.
So there was an all-woman slate of mayor, police chief, fire chief, and treasurer and something. At the time, they all ran as a slate. And it was an all-woman slate, and the woman running for mayor's husband was a member of the all-male slate, and the women won.
And was it in that year or like a little bit after?
It was real early. It
Real
was, I
early.
mean, they were, the picture was like 1,800 women
Yeah.
in the
Oh my God. So
bloomers. And,
I remember flipping past a picture of Wyoming in this book, and it showed like a dirty, dusty main street of Wyoming, and set the caption under it was something like, you know, women have get the right to vote in Wyoming. And I thought, I was looking for something else, so I didn't stop. But I thought, well, why Wyoming?
Yeah.
You know, like I didn't realize the significance of it.
so early.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah.
They wanted progeny.
In the 1900s. Except for Colorado.
I know with Utah, they actually were hoping the women would vote to get rid of polygamy, but they didn't because they were part of the religion that supported polygamy and okay with it in a sort of maybe brainwashed way.
Wow. Yeah, that's a whole nother ball of wax, isn't it?
But you know, it's still, I still see this, I am from Utah, by the way, but today I see a lot of women who will vote for someone like Trump. And you have to wonder about that. And even though a lot more women are getting education, they still maybe getting a religious education, or they're still not really thinking critically.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe under control of someone else's,
Yeah.
either a church or a husband or.
Mm-hmm.
Or their interests are different. I know someone that she's a businesswoman and she likes the things for less regulation in businesses, and she's a Trump supporter for not being taxed as much because she's very wealthy. And
yeah. Well, I know someone who voted for him because she was drowning under medical debt and she's since passed, but like I could understand why she felt that way because she was dying and couldn't afford her medical treatment. You know, that's a desperate situation. You know.
Well, then how'd that work out? I'm just saying, was there a big change in the medical situation?
I mean, I'm just having compassion for her.
Yeah.
She did pass, and
Oh,
but it was a very bad life situation for her.
yeah. And so she was hopeful. She was hopeful that it would improve.
Yeah.
So were the steel workers and the coal workers, even though they had no reason for hope, except words. No rational
It
reason.
hasn't paid off yet, has it?
Nope.
You know, I believe that Nevada is majority female at the state-ledged level.
Yeah.
Really? Is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And on your relative voting, at one of the national conventions, there's a pollster and giving a keynote speech, and she she mentioned the statistics they found on, they asked men if they and their wives voted the same way. The men, it's something like 76% of the men said, oh yes, absolutely, my wife and I vote the same. The women were like 32%.
Wise work.
And where,
It's all private.
where
That's
was
what they
this?
call it.
Oh, this was in Nevada.
No, this is
Oh,
no,
national.
nationwide.
poll.
Oh, it was
So that was the US.
Oh my God, that's so good.
Statistics, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, it's all private when you go to the polls.
Yeah,
Nobody knows.
that's, except Russia. No, I'm sorry. But that is the beauty of it, you know? But I don't know that some people, even knowing that it's secret and it's private, I feel like there are those who, yeah, don't
Are
really
afraid.
capitalize on that.
Yeah.
They're afraid.
If they're afraid at something like that where supposedly nobody would know,
Yes,
what about the rest of their life?
yes.
Once they
Well,
know.
My grandfather was an Indiana Republican, and my grandmother came from a very blue-collar union family, and so he would go and vote, and she would say, Harry, I'm gonna go cancel your vote right now.
why don't you just stay home? That's so funny. Okay, we're done.